Hello! Today we are going to be talking about the impact of the industrial age. Take a look at this picture of the water droplet right here. As it lands in the water, it creates a ripple that spreads out and touches other things in the water. This is like how industrialization spread out to impact many other things, such as science, culture, and society. This will help us answer the lesson question, how did the spread of industrialization impact science, culture, and society? In this lesson, we are going to learn about the effects of industrialization. Let's take a look at these lesson goals. First, we're going to describe how industrialization spread from Britain to other countries. Then, we are going to identify innovations and advancements that resulted from industrialization. Finally, we're going to explain how industrialization influenced culture. Before you start working towards these goals, let's take some time to preview some key words to know. Now, let's look at the words we need to know for this lesson. Accelerated, emigrate, assembly line, romanticism, and popular culture. Keep an eye out for these words in your lesson. This is an image from the World's Fair, also known as the Chicago World's Fair. It was held in Chicago in 1893 to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the discovery of the New World in 1492. At the fair, people walked around at night with the benefit of electric lights. They rode the first Ferris wheel. They watched the first moving pictures and saw the first electric dishwasher. All of these advancements would not have been possible without industrialization. In this lesson, we are going to focus on the question of how did industrialization spread impact science, culture, and society? Let's begin our lesson. In this lesson, we are going to answer the question, how did the spread of industrialization impact science, culture, and society? First, we're going to discuss innovation in America. In the warm-up, we talked about how advancements in science and technology were showcased at the 1893 World's Fair. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain, but it soon spread to other countries like the United States. Let's learn about that first. An abundance of natural resources allowed the United States to industrialize rapidly. The United States had several advantages for industrialization. These advantages include navigable waterways, rich mineral resources, fertile land, and massive forests. The artwork here is of Catskill Scenery by Thomas Cole, which shows the abundant natural resources of the eastern United States. Look at the waterfall, the many trees, and the water. These are examples of the resources that allowed for rapid industrialization. Recall that the textile industry was one of the first to industrialize in Europe. The same was true in the United States. Let's look at that next. During the Industrial Revolution, Britain tried hard to keep their manufacturing ideas to themselves. Britain tried to stop the spread of industrial technology. They barred mechanics, engineers, and toolmakers from leaving the country. A man named Samuel Slater was an important figure during this time. He immigrated from the United States in 1789. He was a young mill worker, and he memorized the plans for building a spinning machine. He was just 21 years old when he emigrated. He struck a deal with the factory owner to recreate English mills. He understood the English systems so well that he was able to modify them into unique systems that better matched the needs of American workers and the factory system. He eventually went into business for himself and grew very wealthy. Samuel Slater is known as the father of the American Industrial Revolution. As the textile industry in the United States grew, entrepreneurs traveled abroad for ideas. Francis Cabot Lowell visited Britain from 1810 to 1812 and learned about the textile industry there. He used what he learned to improve the industry in the United States. He pioneered textile manufacturing in the U.S. This meant he used water to power mills, he mechanized every stage of textile production, he improved the power loom, and he hired and housed female workers. His factories recruited single women as workers and built boarding houses for them to live in safely. Francis Cabot Lowell's innovations greatly improved the United States textile industry, and by giving women a chance to earn a living, he began to transform the role of women in society. Let's look at some other factors that helped industrialization expand in the United States. Until the Civil War, the U.S. remained a primarily agrarian society. That would all change following the innovations of big business owners like Andrew Carnegie. American industrialization exploded following the Civil War. Important industries included steel manufacturing and meatpacking. American industrialists like Andrew Carnegie turned new methods of manufacturing, like the Bessemer process for steelmaking, into the largest, most powerful companies the world had ever seen. This explosion of growth is called the Second Industrial Revolution. Henry Ford perfected the assembly line. An assembly line is a system of industrial production in which items are mass-produced in a continuous flow. This greatly reduced the time and cost of making an automobile, and soon many industries were adapting this method of manufacturing. New inventions and innovations turned the United States into a world economic power. The Second Industrial Revolution would turn the U.S. into a world economic power and result in the rapid growth of cities like New York, Chicago, and St. Louis. Next, we will look at one of history's most influential inventors. Thomas Edison was a famous and prolific inventor of this time. He is regarded as one of the greatest inventors in history. He founded one of the world's first modern research laboratories. He patented more than 1,000 inventions. One of his important contributions was creating one of the first modern research laboratories. Some scientists and historians regard this development as Edison's greatest achievement. He created the world's first electric power system and is also known for the phonograph, which is a way to record sound. There were also other very important inventions during this time period. Americans did not necessarily invent these things, but they did either improve these inventions or find a way to manufacture them and make them available to everyone. Here are some of the inventions. The telegraph, which was invented in 1836. It was invented by Samuel Morse. The telephone, in 1876, invented by Alexander Graham Bell. The electric light bulb, in 1879. It was invented by Thomas Edison. Well, he did not invent the first electric light bulb, but he invented the first commercially practical incandescent light bulb to be mass-produced. Next, the airplane, in 1903. The Wright brothers invented this. New inventions and innovations resulted in improvements in other areas as well. After electricity was used to power a light bulb, it was soon powering machinery in factories. Now, let's look to see what you have learned so far. We just learned about how the Industrial Revolution spread to the United States and the innovation that resulted. Now, let's explore the industrialization of the European continent. Britain actually tried to stop the spread of its industrialization that would soon spread to the continent. Skilled workers secretly carried plans for building textile machineries and emigrated to Belgium, which was one of the first countries to industrialize. They built their own textile factories, and soon the technology spread across the continent. Political division restricted widespread industrialization in Germany. Germany began to industrialize in the 1830s. It limited areas, mostly in the West, and included coal and iron resources. In the beginning, industrialization was only in limited areas, mostly in the West. This area near the Ruhr River Valley is home to vast coal and iron resources. Next, after unification, industrialization accelerated. Following unification in 1871, industrialization took off. Germany's steel production began to grow rapidly. It included a vast network of railroads, which were constructed, and second in steel production to the United States. By 1900, Germany's steel production exceeded that of Britain and ranked second to the U.S. Like the U.S., it was becoming an industrial giant. Other countries would also industrialize. By 1870, industrialization had spread to the U.S. and Europe. French industrialization, which began about 1850, was slowed by political unrest. Other areas would slowly develop pockets of industrialization. Take a look at this chart right here. This chart compares the level of production of different industrialized nations by 1870. This table shows the percentage distribution of the world's manufacturing production in 1870. Great Britain was leading the world in production of manufactured goods. Over the next 40 years, this would change as more and more countries industrialized. Now, let's take a look at the chart that compares the same countries but over two different time periods. Industrialization in Europe led to important discoveries in science and medicine. First, let's take a look at Marie Curie. She was a Polish physicist who worked in France and famous for her research with her husband on radioactivity, and she was the first woman to be awarded the Nobel Prize. Next, Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur was a French scientist who discovered that diseases are spread by bacteria, a discovery that saved countless lives. He discovered that heat could kill germs, a process called pasteurization, and also discovered a vaccine for rabies. Industrialization also changed how artists viewed and interpreted the world. You now know that industrialization spread from Britain to the United States and to Europe. You also know that this would result in other countries making great technological and economic advancements, especially the US and Germany. This spread of industrialization would result in great changes in culture and society across Europe and America, and eventually around the world. Industrialization also led to a new movement in the arts called Romanticism, which emerged in the late 1700s. It emphasized imagination and emotion, and it influenced art, music, and literature. Romanticism emphasized imagination and emotional elements of the human experience. Here is one example. The writer Edgar Allan Poe, pictured here, is known for his tales of horror and suspense. Other writers were influenced by this movement as well. The industrialization movement influenced the literature of the period as well. William Wordsworth was an English nature writer credited with launching the English Romantic movement. William Blake came to be regarded as the earliest and most original of the Romantic poets. Now, let's look at two other important authors of the industrial era. Charles Dickens was an English novelist who described the problems of industrialized England, such as in his novel, Hard Times. Mark Twain was an American humorist and novelist who was critical of American society in his novels, including The Gilded Age. Dickens, who was British, and Twain, who was American, were known for their critical writing about the excesses and problems resulting from industrialization. Many people had additional time to read for pleasure. Let's see what else they did with their spare time. One important effect of industrialization was the growth of popular culture, which began to grow in the late 1800s. Mass market books and magazines, leisure activities and entertainment, spectator sports, and vaudeville and motion pictures were all part of popular culture. By the late 1800s, most workers had shorter working hours. Unlike those who owned a farm, people had most of Saturday and all-day Sunday off. This led to increased leisure time. Industrialization included high-speed presses that could mass-produce books, magazines, and newspapers. People had time to watch sporting events, vaudeville shows. The modern Olympic Games were revived. In the US, baseball and boxing were king. In Europe, the first professional soccer clubs formed. Take a look at this image right here. It's from 1909, and it's Europeans playing soccer. City parks were also created. By the early 1900s, the movies were born. Take a look at the timeline for this lesson. In 1789, Samuel Slater emigrated to the United States. In 1903, the Wright brothers achieved the first powered flight. From 1860 to 1914 was the Second Industrial Revolution. And in 1908, Henry Ford pioneered the assembly line. Now let's take a look at what else was happening in world history at this time. During this time was the First Industrial Revolution, which was from 1760 to 1840. It was the age of revolutions. Unrest was spreading across Europe, especially France, Germany, and Italy, as people began to demand political and economic reforms. World War I was beginning, and it began in 1914. Industrialization would also impact warfare. Manufacturing made weapons such as guns and tanks easier to make and repair. The steam engine made it easier to transport weapons and soldiers. The telegraph allowed for communication of information between military units. This changed the way wars were fought. Let's review what we learned in this lesson and revalue how we answered the lesson question, how did the spread of industrialization impact science, culture, and society?